For that conference on Pontus Hultén, his life, his work, personal and professional. We're welcoming Jean-Bert Martin, he's a curator, Anne-Sophie Nering and Annika Hörner for this roundtable session. Jean-Bert Martin worked with Pontus Hultén as the Pompidou manager and for contemporaneous collections. And as curator of exhibition, you have a lot of experience, and you worked on the exchange within Europe. You worked in France, in Germany, and in Italy. So the director of the Moderna Museet of Stockholm, Anne-Sophie Nering, you've been in this position since 2010. And for 9 years, you were curator, organizing a Gross exhibition on Gabriel Roscoe. And you will bear witness directly to the work, in fact, which is in line with that of Pontus Hultén. And Annika Hörner, a research worker at the Southampton University, worked on exchanges across the 20th century, before and after World War II, and especially Cobrat.
Merci.
Bonjour, vous êtes très bienvenue.
You are more than welcome. I'm sorry that I shall be presenting in English.
Moderna Museet would not be the museum it is without Pontus Hultén. Sometimes we try to write history through the directors, and I think that's very much wrong. But in some cases, it helps a bit to think about who has been in charge. And here we have two men, and I want to start with this image because Pontus Hultén, Swede, born in the 20s, lived a long life, and he started out as a scholar and also a film maker and somebody very interested in music. But he had the soul of an artist, I would say, and that is one of the basic reasons, I think, for him making a success in the art world and in the museum world. He is standing together with Jean Tinguely, a long-time friend. He had many friends among artists because as a young man he went to Paris, he was in New York, he made acquaintances with artists, and they meant a lot for him for the whole life and for our museum. This is a jump into the future or to the now, I would say. It's a study gallery at the museum. So if you come to Stockholm, please come and visit. And if you go downstairs, so to say, into the heart of the museum, you'll find a study gallery. And it's named after Pontus Hultén because he donated his private collection to the museum in 2006 when he died, and we inaugurated this study gallery in 2008. And on these walls, which you can get up and down like with a robot, very typical for Pontus Hultén, you can see some of the works he donated. But the study gallery is devoted very much to exhibitions and curatorial studies, just in the spirit of Pontus Hultén. Well, the museum did not start with Pontus Hultén. It started with Guernica, and that was in 1956. And it was installed in the naval premises of an island at the center of Stockholm. In 1958, the museum got started. Really, it was inaugurated, and it started actually with an architectural exhibition, Le Corbusier. And even though Pontus Hultén was not really involved in this, I think it's also something which he was very much into, to mix disciplines, to interact, and to see that everything can make sense. If you put them together, it makes more sense than just showing one thing. So mix architecture, paintings, have music into the museum, make it alive. That is one of his groundstones, so to say, for his way of directing. This is an image from one of the first exhibitions, which was very wide widely known, and this is Movement in Art, which was shown at the museum in 1961. And this was based on very much his friendship with many artists, also the dead ones, I would say, because he was not only the one who went to Paris and America, he also was very interested in Russian concretism and with other ways of expressing. But this was the movement in art, that it was cooperation with Stedelijk, and we'll come back to that, I think. Maybe Annika will say something about it, or Jean Hubert, we'll see. And a key figure in this was, and still is for the museum, Marcel Duchamp. And as you might know, his work are installed in Philadelphia in the US, but we do have a great collection of Marcel Duchamp because he came to Moderna Museet. Everybody liked, are you there? Yes. Everybody liked to come there from abroad and to visit the museum and to stay on, and Marcel Duchamp did as well. So he signed a copy, and that is also one of the sort of traits of Pontus Hultén's directing, because Sweden, though we didn't go into the World War II, we were pretty poor, and the museum was extremely poor, still is, and you have to find new ways to show works. So replicas is one way of doing it. I come back to the Brille boxes very briefly afterwards, because I think you have got to know about that a little bit. So we have actually two glasses by Marcel Duchamp, one which is traveling and one we have in the museum in the collection. And this is another sculpture from Movement in Art, and that is, of course, Calder. Some more images, and I just flip through to another person, because Pontus Hultén was not alone. You cannot do this alone. You have to have very good friends, and this is Billy Cleaver. He was an engineer. He was based in the US. He knew all artists. He was working with world art fairs, and he also founded something called Experiment in Art and Technology. So that was also in the way of Pontus Hultén's thinking, to combine art and technology and to get artists to produce new works and find new territories. This is an icon from the collection, and it was not from the beginning. It was actually something the minister didn't want. You know, we are a state museum, and the museum was at that time also, and we get donations, but we have to have good politicians who help us also. They didn't want to help out. But this iconic sculpture, monogram by Robert Rauschenberg, was shown in an American exhibition in 1962 already. And Pontus Hultén came back to the US many times and was also criticized for that, but it made debate, and debate is good. This work he had to really push to get into the collection. And then he invented a project actually called the Museum of Our Wishes. He collected lots of works from Europe mainly, and some of the very classical works from the beginning of the 20th century. And then the state gave him and the museum actually 500,000 euros to acquire many works. This work was with the help of friends, of course, also. I flip through, and here we are still in the US, and the world can see here. And this is also from an American pop exhibition. And here's Robert Rauschenberg himself acting in 5 New York evenings, and he's actually doing a performance, or happening, as one said at that time. And this was the first time. The last time he showed something called the Elgin Tie, and you can see him climbing down and making a happening happen. And here you see a cow, and Robert Rauschenberg is actually going out from the theater room of the museum, and the cow is sort of helping him out. And how did the cow come here? Of course, because Pontus Hultén had a nephew who was a farmer, and he brought the cow. Good to have friends, you know. This is one iconic show, which I think Annika will come back to, and it's called She, the Cathedral. And this was made by Nikitson Fall, Jean Tinguely, as I mentioned from the beginning, and together with the Swedish artist P.O. Ultvedt. And, well, a cathedral of our time. Here we see Nikki. And you could enter through the vagina, so this was sort of sexual liberation for the whole family. And you could go into her, or the body, and you could go sliding, you could go into a bar. You can even see an art exhibition there with fakes, you know, coming back to the reproductions. Another friend, this is Klaus Oldenburg. He was supposed to be into this show, but he had a solo exhibition right after. And Merit Oppenheim, here you see her with her iconic fur cup. And the museum actually acquired another iconic piece by her. This was in '67. And here comes '68. This was a year of demonstrations in Stockholm and all over Europe and all over the world, I would say. And Pontus Hultén brought Andy Warhol. That was a little bit of a problem because some were very critical towards the US and thought, oh, another American artist. And here he has wrapped up the whole museum with wallpaper and another cow watching his sort of relatives, and another image of Pontus Hultén meeting an artist. Also this, you know, what a museum can be with a director who has a soul of an artist, I would say. Making friendship also makes it happen. In this show, there were also replicas, coming back to that, and I will not go into the very problematic case of the Brillo boxes, but I can just mention that the museum now has an exhibition which also deals with this question of how to make replicas and how can you make them part of a collection, and how far can you go. I'm soon wrapping up here and leaving the word to Jean-Hubert Martin, but I would like to show one example also about sort of educational workshops and also exhibitions approaching and also welcoming all kinds of people without having any ideas or preconceived ideas what a piece of art could be. This was called the model, and it was a model of sort of another way of living, another society. And even the Prime Minister came here to jump into the mattresses here. And towards the end, in Stockholm, he was director there from 1960 until '73. The Black Panther Party, radical. And they were also taking part in different kinds of happenings and dialogues and exhibitions. Buckminster Fuller, another artist who was very into new ideas. This bucket dome, I would say. And into this bucket dome, you could find musicians and talks and seminars and all kinds of interacting. The very, very late time was wrapping up this interest in, well, it's biased American art. But anyway, there were people wanting to give the museum some iconic pieces, and there was a launch for New York collection for Moderna Museet, and some of the very famous artists at that time and famous today, they got together with this Billy Cleaver I mentioned before, and actually some of the works you can see in this image stayed in the museum. And not least also Robert Rauschenberg, back again, Mud Muse, a fantastic piece which is very hard to tour, I would say. We try sometimes, we have gone to South America with this, but now we will show it in the fall. So if you come to visit us in the fall, you will see it, and it's going to be into show which is dealing with art and technology of our time. And last but not least, an image from, well, visitors, the public, because that is also, besides having the soul of the artist and dealing with the interdisciplinary ways of thinking, and also being in the right place all the time, Pontus Hultén was totally interested in having a dialogue with the visitors, with the public. Without the public, the museum would not be there. So that is, in short, the formative years of his directing in Stockholm. And I will leave over to France and to Jean-Hubert Martin, who will speak French.
First, Annika, no? Oui, donc on vous l'a dit, vous l'avez compris.
Rightly heard, Pontus Hultén was highly creative, madly highly creative. He was a personality who was quite a character, I must say. He didn't like rational thinking, or very little so, and in quite a paradoxical approach to his life. We would like to discuss Pontus Hultén between Stockholm, Amsterdam, and Paris. I don't know why Amsterdam, but I can give you a reason. In fact, no, it was Amsterdam was quite a failure, I must say, because he was approached as director of the State Museum, and Willem Sambing, the very famous director of the State Museum in Amsterdam, who had been, in fact, the number one in having all the avant-garde after-war artists into these museums, had pointed to him as a director. But this, in fact, didn't take place because he made an interview with the journalist, said, hey, but you've been drinking too much beer, so you cannot be a candidate. So this candidature was removed. Back in Paris, 1973, very complex. The Moderna Museum was already there, the National Museum of Modern Art, moving out to be the Pompidou Centre, which is always the case, still the case anyway. Very often there was a lot of resistance from the curators. Anyway, there he came, 1973. He was invited because Pompidou had heard about him, famously. And he was part of the team that pre-represented the Pompidou Centre. It was 71 until the opening of the Pompidou Centre in 77. So he became the director of the Museum of Modern Art in 75. And I was there, not those who were in the resistance movement. I was among his team because I found his project was wonderful. Now, if you look at what I'm going to do in a very short period of time, if you look at his program at the opening of this Pompidou Centre, you can really understand the character, who he was, and his main interest or fields of interest. Now, you should think about the context in which this center was being built and opened. This was after May 68. Most of the people who were working with me in the team were young, and May 68 who were students, and we had the intelligentsia against us. Typically, this is very much Parisian. When there's something new, you criticize it. And at a given time, everyone was telling us, well, you're going to have this huge building, it's going to be a failure, and it's a refinery that you're building, and there'll be no one in the refinery. So we're told. We're so frightened that 8 months before the opening, we decided, are we going to have a garden of sculpture instead of this museum like the Siena Square by Renzo Piano? We called the Gross Circus. We had a tent for a circus, and as soon as it was open, in fact, it became a real success. So this center opened with that forum in front of it. There was a big hole. And Jean Tinguely with Nikit Sanfal and Daniel Shipori, organized that phantom train, the crocodrome, like you have in some fair exhibitions. And then you had a tiny museum down behind by Daniel Schwertz, this very first sentimental museum. And then, looking at various regions, in fact, we understood what the objective was in his vision. He wanted it to be an encyclopedic type of museum. 20th century encyclopedia are a very wide vision, globalist in a way. You had two locations where you had art from other countries. At the end of this corridor, we had African art, which we had borrowed from the Musée de l'Homme, and then we had works from Oceania. You see that showcase in the second room? Oceania, that is to say. Now, what is very important is that for a long time we thought that Pompidou had been organized to show the relation between Cubists and Africa and the influence that they had. But no, in our mind, in Pontus Hultén's mind, we wanted to show that there was creation everywhere in the world, and not only in the Western country, and that in fact the creation was everywhere. Then, the collections of the museum could not report on this, but he had work from Mexico, the USSR, Poland, ready to show modernity had spread everywhere across the globe. And then, in 74, major purchases, iconic Nordbus, that work was striking for the artists and media, especially my generation, showing that, yes, we had someone who was really working with the present life, and that we were much more than a museum of modern art as it was before. And we had placed this Museum of Modern Art in a niche because we had identified before the Museum of Modern Art, in fact, was not only looking more at artists of the past, i.e. dead artists, than contemporary type of artists. So here with some friends, Mary Rivers on the left, you see. She's mimicking Manet, Fowler's drum. He bought quite a few pieces of him that are very often exhibited. Some Swedish artists, Bertling or Mortensen also. Now, he was welcomed in Paris, but as an avant-garde, light. The carrier or the spokesperson for the American art, which is not true at all. It has just been said. Of course, Andy Warhol exhibition. Of course, Overton Jones exhibition, because he found those were wonderful artists, and they were. But it was not at all oriented or dedicated to this American art. Yet he bought this one, extremely important piece of art. Pollock, you see? Oddly enough, this is atypical of Pollock. Rather characteristic of Hultén, not to buy the iconic piece of work that you might have awaited, the usual standard dripping from him. But no, to play more on his sensitivity, his intuitive aspect, and Pollock. So I want more and more white. So it was not deep, it was just white and white and white. And this is exactly, and that's sculpture, by the way, from an American sculptor, Yankiewicz, who was working with Tingelli, very close to him. But he had not included any movement in his Yankiewicz. He was welding waste metal pieces. And this major contribution here, he had creation into the museum from France. new realistic movement was not represented in the collection, or very little. He admired someone he thought was the #1 artist of his generation. So he bought this iconic work of art. He bought Sherry, Rembrandt, Tingley, that I've already discussed. And back on this American art time, of course, he was very much aware of the fact that the New York School had to be represented one way or another. But he said, I want the Americans to pay for the work we're going to receive, well, for their artists. And that's exactly what happened. He was sheltered from any criticism because, in fact, none of the major American work had been bought with taxpayer money from France. Nothing at all. As Anne-Sophie told you, he was very open to any type of audience, visitors, and art. In '77, when the museum opened, you see Bernard Buffet? He was already very much criticized and decried in this sophisticated art of critics of contemporaneous art. It was Rangard. He put Buffet because those who've never been in the Moderna Museum came just to see him, and they would not have understood that an artist whom we had everywhere in all the magazines in France, and that they knew the name, would not have been there. So he also bought the bench shop, you know, bench shop. We saw it together in the Samplon Gallery, where I looked at it with Hultén and told Daniel Templon, I want to buy it for the museum. And I said, I was surprised. And he said, yes, it has a lot of anthropological value. And I found it very interesting. Typically, Pontus Hultén to work from a very wide type of register. And he had knowledge on philosophy, anthropology, ethnology. He looked very much into Greenland and these countries. And you see all this opening up to new arts. Then he decided to organize an exhibition program. 3 major monographies, 3 major artists that had never been shown in Paris, never been exhibited in Paris. Picabia, Duchamp, and Malevich. And then we have this major exhibition that really made the fame of all these people. So Picabia, he wanted to have the exhibition right away. He was very impatient. So he decided to organize it at the Grand Palais before the opening of the Pompidou Center. I was very lucky to be the curator for that exhibition. And coverage of the catalog, wanted to do it in relief, in 3D. We could not because there was the editing director who was rather narrow-minded, so it didn't work. Look at this wonderful catalog I find of this type of exhibition. It's his exhibition on machines at the Museum of Modern Art in '68, I guess. I don't remember. Wonderful. The book binding is in metal. Cover is in pressed metal. 3D, very pop art. Then, by the way, for that Picabia exhibition, it's extraordinary because I guess it's the largest exhibition ever of Picabia, showing all the periods of Picabia. And at a given time, he said, but listen, to show the love of cars that Picabia had, why don't you put a car? So we put that Delage 1920 in the exhibition. This was typically him, that type of ideas.
And the Duchamp exhibit, it was so relevant because he felt that Americans were actually taking Duchamp theirs, and he felt like he had to take Duchamp back to his birthplace. So somehow, we entered the monographic Duchamp exhibit through a market, a typical Norman market structure. So to place him in his birth province, which was Normandy, and we discovered actually how many works were influenced by his childhood and reminiscence from Normandy. And the Malevich exhibit, at that time, we only knew the famous collection at the Sterling Museum of Amsterdam that Malevich had brought to Berlin and that had stayed throughout the war, hidden in some place, and that was bought afterwards. So we discovered some aspects from Malevich that we didn't know. The period end of the 20s and beginning of 30s. And we didn't know that period so he showed 2 or 3 paintings from that period. And on the left side, you see an architecton, which is an architectural a model that Malevich made, and this is a reconstitution. Then we did find the original ones, but this was taken after a photograph in black and white, and we thought that the dimension was another one, but we were wrong. Well, anyhow, it was a way to show all this. And then come the famous big exhibits, Paris and something, and in the Sultan's spirit, it should have been 2 exhibits to show artists wandering. It wasn't the markets per se, the New York market or the Paris market that interested him, but he was really interested in seeing the wandering of the artists between one continent and the other. They went west to New York, from Paris to New York, and then east from Paris to Moscow and Berlin, and the Paris-New York exhibit was very successful. Actually, the cover of the catalog was made by Rivas, and this is a reconstitution of Kinsler's scenography in the exhibit, and it's the kind of things that Hultén loved because it showed the work in a different way, from a different perspective, and in history he could find examples of very creative scenographies. And then we turn to Moscow. He goes to Moscow, he has a first contact, and he comes back from Moscow with a first list of work proposed by the Russians themselves. It was actually the work of the Stukin, the works of the Stukin collections. There aren't many French in the room, but I'd like to take the advantage of this to tell you that the Stukin collection that was shown at the LVMH not long ago was fine, but almost all these paintings had been shown through several exhibitions that were regularly sent to France through diplomatic exchanges between France and the USSR in the 1960s and 70s. So he was shown this, but he said, no, that's not what I want to show. I want to show what was always hidden, the vanguard, like Rodchenko and all. So back to the Russian contacts, and they say, okay, we could have the exhibit the way you think of, but let's eliminate Berlin. So this was 1977, and the exhibits was to take place in 1978. So Pontus, of course, we knew that the Paris-Moscow exhibit was to be later on, but then he thought, well, what do we do next year? And I with innocence of youth, told him, why not do Paris-Berlin? Well, we did it with we discovered all German museums, and this gave this wonderful exhibit that was more successful than Paris-Moscow, Whereas for us, as art historian, Paris-Moscow was so much more important because it revealed for the first time, it showed these works that we vaguely knew from photographs, but no one had seen them, either the artists from Moscow at the time nor anyone internationally. So that Paris-Berlin exhibit was a kind of cultural catharsis between France and Germany. It was the beginning of that building, that construction of Europe, and the fact that both countries got closer on cultural terms was essential. Then Paris-Moscow, this was a reconstitution. This was the passion of Pontus Hultén, because he already had a exhibit in Stockholm, and he had reconstituted the Tower of Tashin, but he knew that there was a mistake because the reconstitution was after 2 or 3 photographs. So just imagine, it wasn't easy, and we had no plans, but by building it, he saw that there was something wrong, and then he made another version that was more exact. There was also one at the Architecture Museum in Moscow, we found out later, and he could find the rasta windows, etc. It was quite a complex a series of negotiations, because the Russians wanted to give us realistic artists and realistic socialist art, and we couldn't escape it. We knew it, so we couldn't just have a vanguard exhibit, an exhibit on the Russian vanguard. So we wanted to find some balance between both, and I think we succeeded. We reconstituted the Berlin Tribune, and also we built the Rodchenko workshop, and the Russians actually called us romantics of revolution, because at the time they weren't interested in the revolution anymore in the 1970s. Another exhibit that was absolutely a success. Oh, I forget one thing. What was a great success was the fact that the Paris-Moscow exhibit went to Moscow afterwards. We did it in Moscow in 1980. And today we could say that that may have been the start somehow of what happened at the end of the 80s, which is, after Gorbachev's arrival with the glasnost and perestroika. This was the first glasnost on cultural terms. And Brezhnev actually visited the exhibit, and our colleagues from the Pushkin Museum were quite thrilled and worried of what Brezhnev would say. And in the end, he signed the exhibition. He said, beautiful exhibition. So they were all relieved. Then the Dali exhibit, we could have done it on. And this was incredible. We did it with Dali's agreement and with great dimensions in the forum. And afterwards, well, that's it. Of course, I tell you about these great exhibits that made history. But at the same time, it was great because he opened a small room called Today's Workshops. And there we showed a very little-known artist from the Parisian scene, from the Paris scene, and it was done with curators. And he was convinced that art was not made only by superheroes. He always said that Picasso was actually borrowing from museums, because as a modern art museum opened, they had to take all their budget for several years to buy a Picasso. And he was not someone close to the market as other museum directors may have been. The market as such didn't interest him much. He did believe that an art scene is made of a myriad of artists and not just one or two who are pushed by our media system. Now, I'll be briefer for the rest because time flies. He leaves the Pompidou Center in 1992, and he directs the Palazzo Grassi in Venice. Again, he has a Duchamp exhibit. Actually, he said from time to time, in the end, one does the same exhibit his whole life. He had another exhibit, a futuristic one, that was quite audacious because nobody dared doing it in Italy because of the link of the futurists at the end of their lives with the fascist government, and then an exhibit on Archibaldo, etc. And then from 1991 to 1995, he goes to Bonn in Germany, which was quite surprising for the people who knew him well because he had lived the war. He was 18 to 20 during the war. He didn't like the Germans much. And he actually said, I mean, there was a legend that said that when he came from Stockholm to Paris by motorcycle when he was young, he filled his cycle deposit in Sweden, and he never stopped where the whole time he was in Germany, and even to pee. And then when he got to France, he could set foot and pee. So he had an exhibit called Territorium Artist, and that was his way to look at contemporary art, where he showed how artists had been empowered, had empowered themselves with a lot of fields that were outside the art. So they weren't just facing stylistic aspects, but also human science aspects. And he showed how art was fed with all these other disciplines. And before we talked about reconstitutions, and I think this really mattered for him, and this has a future because the idea of the authentic original work for the 20th century is kind of dubious, and being able to copy and make replicas has some future ahead. I tried to define his taste. It's quite hard in the case of Pontus Hultén. I don't think he was keen of abstract art. It took him time to buy before he bought a Mondrian. For the Modern Art Museum, it was kind of incredible wound because Denise René in the 60s had organized a Mondrian exhibit. Everybody was quite enthusiastic about it in the art scene, and there was some pressure on the Modern Art Museum to buy a Mondrian. Malraux said, why not? Why don't you bring the painting in my office? I'll have it in my office and look at it. And after 3 weeks, he said, no, that's not good. And so we put pressure on him because it was it was a way to repair a wound. So he bought a Mondrian, but he wasn't fully enthusiastic about it. He went other ways, actually. Actually, one time he said that what he was quite struck by was a discussion he had with the Chinese museum director, who told him that abstract art, especially Mondrian, he didn't understand what it meant. And I think that in Hultén thought that art was universal and should be understood everywhere. So he liked representation and images. But I'll stop here because I think I already took too long. And I would like to conclude by saying he had a wonderful sentence. He said, anyhow, one is always wrong. And I think it's important to know when you're a museum manager, director, you never hold the truth.
Well, and we have a slide. Thank you so much, Anne-Sophie and Jean-Hubert, really for this brilliant exposition of these fantastic projects. I will just end shortly here to make some suggestions of how to understand the contexts and the how should you say, the spatial qualities of the work that Pontus did in the 60s and how we can be looking from them today. My point of departure is to sort of, from this more linear description of what he did, try to find some kind of critical moments, spatial places for us to understand how we can develop on his work and how it also was based on the 60s, what he did here in France, in a way. It's also the theme of the festival, the Scandinavian theme, that makes this important to do, I feel. The position here in Scandinavia was determined by the neutrality of the Swedish nation, its constant balancing between the strong powers, developing an extremely complex, advanced diplomacy when we talk about foreign politics. And this is this kind of ambience and the space where he came from. So I would visit 3 examples from early exhibitions by Hultén that both represent and signify certain important moments and spatial relations and could be viewed as determining of what he would achieve later in his career. And as we all know, an exhibition is not just the sum of its containing artworks that we have been learned from Mickey Ball and other art theorians, but it's a greater it's a rather performance of the entire show and its visual markers and the actions that surrounds it. So my first spatial note would be on the avant-garde and the institution with the example of the American pop art as departure point. And this is, as you know, this is the first, we already heard that, it's the first American pop-up show in Europe in a museum. It had this title, not just American pop art, but 106 forms of love and despair. And actually, it was Hultén's account on American pop could be seemed a little bit surprising. He said, because this takes place in America, where they never have had an autonomous art before. It is only natural that these artists choose America as the subject of their images. But this is not seen ironically, rather in desperation, as if in an attempt to love without being loved back. They have a strong urge for self-expression and a need to be loved, these American artists, but their emotion seems to be short-circuited, as if despite their efforts, it is impossible to love this world of plastic and lacquered metal. Abstract expressionism is replaced by frustrated expressionism. I don't know if anyone of you have heard a similar take on American art before, and in Sweden, it was something coming from the West. It's a popular culture, happiness, openness, that kind of things. In order to do this, this is an example of how he worked. He was playing in the tension between the avant-garde and the institution of the museum to be connected with avant-garde or being an institution, or even himself being a representative of an institution or belonging to the artist and the avant-garde. And it was also the case that, I don't know, it was like 7-8 months of production, this show, which is unthinkable if anyone who works with exhibition to make such an exhibition in that little time. But he was completely also dependent on other factors than his own genius and pillar cleavers in New York, while the market was present. Iliana Sonnabend and Leo Castelli and other galleries in America helped extensively to choose and to find good works, with their interest, of course, in helping artists and in the love of art, but also, which has been established, to create a market in New York, because in the early 60s, no rich people on Higher East Manhattan could buy pop art, but they bought Impressionism, I guess. But after this, they could say, well, this has been shown in a European museum, so this was sort of a way to foster a situation. And the other thing is that he was helped by the avant-garde in terms of the intention or the help by some Swedes, like you probably know that Klaus Oldenburg was a Swede, and also Eivind Fahlström, Barbara Östlin, and others, round in the studios in Manhattan in order to find the proper works for the show. So the avant-garde and the institution are the two poles here. The second situation I would just want to present is about the gendered body in the museum, showing you a work that you all know, I guess, and also a work that has been recently more or less been framed as a piece by Hultén. And we also see how he very carefully staged it. It was built up behind certain walls, so the press, there was international press coming to the museum 1 week before, and they had no clue that Hun was on the other side of this wall, because he really wanted to be in charge of when the information comes out. And the so-called catalogue, which is not a catalogue, but it is a post-production publication, the one we see here, came 1 year after with the whole history, the whole framing of what this is, and also the reception of the critique. And it was about good friends coming together, working as a collective, and produce something that will not rest after it's been destroyed. And here you see him also destroying Hun during the last day. Of course, underneath here we have a lot of other things going on, like Niki de Saint-Phal taking on the dress as a carpenter, as they all did, in this, we could say, production in the mail factory. We can also use other examples from the archives, like the upper to the left, where Saint-Phal actually is acting Hun in the middle of Tanguy or in between Tanguy and Ultuet. So, which to me is like kind of, you could interpret this image as well, the double role she had as an artist and as a female person, which is in the 60s in Moderna Museet, there you could see female artists, but they were few. She was one of very few. This was a very male decade in this field. And Oldenburg was not in Hun, he should have been, but he got his own exhibition afterwards and was building it, looking right into the vagina, and has talking about it quite bluntly as something that is, he was looking right into the cunt, and he made fun of that. And there are other tension between Niki and Ultuet in this show. Will just sum up, and maybe this is a thing to continue discuss, is that the third, not second, spatial note between East and West is, as already was mentioned by, I think, both of you, that the Andy Warhol exhibition, again, one of the first retrospective Andy Warhol ever, in '68 in Moderna Museet, was actually not just a result of some kind of idea that of Hultén to foster American art, because the day after it closed, 1 week later, you had this other exhibition. I believe this is a single one photo of the rest in an archive of the exhibition, The Language of Revolution, Communist Posters from the Entire World from '68, which was a cooperation with the Lenin Museum in Warsaw. And it was a very international, including also Swedish thing. So here we have again the Tatlin's power, and maybe this could be a good last plate for a beginning discussion, I don't know, where you see a reenactment of Tatlin's maquette, and it's really fun how they also very consciously have placed the carpenters more or less directly as in the original, try to restage the early avant-garde in the neo-avant-gardian situation. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for staying on and listening to us. Well, we were going to have a discussion up here at the panel, but as we have talked for like 3 days about Pontus Hultén and the formative years and what all these mean and what it can mean for us now in the future, I would like, we have such a short time left here, I would actually hand out the microphone to you to see if there are any questions among you in the audience. Is there any there? Can I see any hand? Yes.
Oh, don't worry, please sit. Where is the hand? Okay.
Je ne sais pas si en français ça ira ou
Yes, I will ask the question in French. Yes, that's perfect. Thank you. Hello, I was quite interested in the last picture of your conference. As Mr. Martin said, it's about the replica. And so your last picture shows it with regards to Laura by Benjamin. It's quite audacious from him, and the contemporary art says it. And you said that he dared to do it as Warhol, and also Duchamp had inaugurated all this. So I think this is quite an interesting comment on that topic.
But it's translated, no? No? Okay. Well, he even made this he had several paintings actually copied by, well, an artist we knew very much, André Raffray. And, you know, there are these highlights of the 20th century, super chef-d'oeuvre, like the Demoiselles d'Avignon. Everybody knows that they can't travel anymore. They want the MoMA will never allow it to travel. And then he had a copy made by André Raffray, which is really the same size, and funnily enough made with a pencil, you know, au crayon de couleur. And it's fantastic. It's a marvelous piece, and he bought it at the end of his life, Pontus, and it's now in the collection of Moderna Museet. And I think we shouldn't refrain from copies like that. We know very well that in the 17th, 18th century, you know, when painting from a famous painter became well known, he had several copies made by the studios, and then this is fantastic now for the art historian to decide whether the hand of the artist is there, or they're only the pupils who are working and the guys in the studio working on it. But usually they're fairly good paintings, you know, because they come out from the studio. So I think instead of you know, concentrating on this sort of trace of the hand of the artist, we should, and I would say we will oblige to do so, because the amount of the exhibitions and this necessity to show works, major works in the whole world, will make that I'm sure that we will have exhibition in a few decades with copies. They need, of course, to be of an excellent quality, but I think the technology of today allows that. Actually, Bruno Latour made some statements in these directions, and he is also convinced of that.
But one important thing is that Pontus had this method of reproducing, making replicas with the museum, with the curators. And what was also important then was to get it authorized by the artist if there was a living artist. Jean Hubert, you just showed us images from the Tower of Tatlin. That was, of course, a reconstruction of something which was never built. But to do this was a survival method for us, and I think it will be for now on also, as shipping cost makes it absolutely impossible sometimes to make exhibitions. So sometimes you have to sort of make it for the public and for the artists also. But I do think that his main thought was to have it agreed upon with the artists, and they signed, like Duchamp did, and Warhol signed and authorized, and that was the thing. So there was in those days a gentleman agreement, I would say. Later on in life, maybe not so much.
And just, I mean, replicas of work of Russian constructivists and Tatlin is not something just going on in Moderna Museet. As you have seen the research of Maria Kauf, who has really looked at the production of those early Russian constructivist furniture and models. There are many museums all over the world doing that. So.
I heard the bell ring, and I think it's 2:00, but could we have one more question? Is it okay with you, or shall we end here?
Unfortunately, we are lacking of time, and like we need to.
Okay.
But maybe another question, a quick one.
A quick.
C'était pour savoir si le cycle
I just wanted to know whether the cycler, which is next to here in Milly-la-Forêt, I'd like to know whether Pontus Hultén knew about it, because Niki de Saint-Phal and Tinguely were there, and she had the pieces of the Pompidou Museum. Yes, absolutely. There's an airway of the Pompidou Center that wasn't used, and I was given, yes, he knew it perfectly. Yes, he followed it regularly because he was very close to Tinguely, who was a close friend. And actually, it was interesting because Tinguely sometimes came to see exhibits before their opening and gave his opinion. And when he saw the exhibit Paris-Moscow, he said, fortunately, we didn't know all this. We couldn't have done all we had done in the 1960s if we had known what the Russians had made. Yes, he knew about the cyclopy. Yes, he came quite often. He saw the work being built. It was actually secret at the time. You know, there were small pathways to get to it until one day Mitterrand came to visit the cyclopy, and then it had to be made public and became public afterwards.
It's going to be a quick ending, and to say thank you from us here at the round or not so round table. And please continue, and you can read more about Pontus Hultén, but I think the main thing is to sort of see what there is still, and maybe also see his way of acting and curating is also there, out in the world. In some museums there is still, and I think that's very, very rewarding and fantastic to take deal of. And thank you for coming, and hope to see you around the last afternoon here.